Welcome to Module 6 of the SHE project. Together we'll refine practical, evidence-informed ways to analyze online misogynistic and sexist hate speech within your professional context. In this section we outline how misogynistic and sexist hate speech functions as a narrative system. We will review its implicit structure, the role of emotions and identity framings, and we will examine masking strategies and common fallacies. Finally, we will introduce a practical decoding workflow for educational contexts and close with a concise summary followed by an applied activity. Narrative mechanisms of online misogynistic and sexist hate speech. Our focus is on how it functions as a narrative system, how framings are constructed, which emotions are mobilized, and how identity positions are set up, how masking strategies and common fallacies maintain deniability, and how a structured decoding workflow supports evidence-informed judgments of impact and risk in education. Why narratives matter. Language does more than offend or persuade, it organizes meaning about who belongs, who is right, and who is wrong. Misogynistic and sexist hate speech typically sits inside a toxic narrative that assigns blame and licenses judgment. Take the line, "Girls only dress like that to provoke." This constructs a world in which girls are presumed guilty and commentators feel entitled to police or attack them. As educators, our task is to help young people recognize these storylines, name the framing at work, and practice rewriting them in ways that center dignity, consent, and inclusion. Like any narrative, online hate speech builds a story. Protagonist, the so-called normal man, presented as silenced or misunderstood. Antagonist, the girl or woman who overreacts, gets offended, or manipulates. Conflict, claims such as, "Nowadays you can't say anything," or "Women don't know how to take a joke," which frame equality as censorship. Justification, appeals to "it's just my opinion," or freedom of speech, used to license hostility and avoid accountability. This narrative inverts responsibility. The hater appears rational and the victim is cast as at fault. Naming each element helps us show learners how the story is constructed and why it meets thresholds for concern, even without explicit slurs. Anger, fear, and disgust help hate speech spread. Anger, the target is framed as deserving a backlash. Fear, equality is presented as a threat, boys will lose out. Disgust, sexualized insults or body shaming. Naming the emotion helps young people and adults see how the message works, not just what it says. When we discuss examples, keep exposure limited and focus on the mechanism, not on repeating slurs. Identity framings show how misogynistic and sexist hate speech assigns positions and power. They decide who is credible and who is suspect, set expectations for behavior, and justify exclusion, harassment, or violence. We focus on 5 recurrent framings: us versus them, reactive victimhood, role reversal, collective blame, and natural hierarchy. With us versus them, women and girls are marked as the problematic side, while men are treated as the normal reference group, setting credibility in advance. Reactive victimhood presents men as censored or disadvantaged, so objections to sexism are reframed as unfair attacks. Role reversal casts women as persecutors and men as innocent, shifting responsibility away from the speaker and minimizing the impact on those targeted. Collective blame generalizes from a single instance to all women and girls, converting an anecdote into a rule. Finally, natural hierarchy justifies unequal treatment as obvious, instinctive, or reasonable. That's how things are, in order to close down challenge. Naming these framings helps us explain impact clearly and show why content can cross concern thresholds even without explicit slurs. Here we look at 2 ways hate speech is masked so it sounds reasonable. First, logical argumentative fallacies, arguments that look rational but break basic reasoning. They give stereotypes and blame shifting a respectable surface. For example, a single anecdote is used as if it proved a rule, or common sense is invoked to defend a sexist claim. The effect is that prejudice appears logical. Second, toxic rhetorical strategies, persuasive moves that shift the focus or legitimize a hostile message. A remark is framed as, just debate, or, only a joke, or attention is redirected so the problem seems to lie elsewhere. The effect is that attacks look acceptable. When we recognize which of these is operating, we can describe not only what is said, but how it gains credibility in the conversation. What do we mean by logical argumentative fallacies in this context? They are patterns that distort reasoning so that misogynistic or sexist hate speech can sound sensible. They are often used to prove that the problem doesn't exist or is exaggerated, giving a rational shape to distorted beliefs. First, false equivalence. Situations with different power, scale, or intent are presented as if they were symmetrical. A sexist slur is equated with a neutral remark, or a call to avoid hate speech is treated as identical to a ban on ordinary conversation. Once this symmetry is asserted, stereotypes look fair and objections are framed as overreaction. Second, false cause, post hoc. Because one event follows another, it is mistaken for causation. For example, after reports from girls and young women begin to be taken seriously, some discomfort voiced by male peers is presented as the effect of excessive sensitivity. The timeline is doing the work of evidence, and responsibility shifts from specific instances of hate speech to a broad group, without any causal link. Third, straw man. A specific criticism is misrepresented into something easier to attack. A request to avoid sexist insults becomes, you claim any comment is hate speech, setting clear norms is recast as, you want to ban opinions. The caricature replaces the original point and makes refusal look reasonable. Fourth, slippery slope. Consequences are magnified to trigger resistance. Limiting sexist hate speech is depicted as the first step towards banning everyday expressions of interest. Recognizing misogynistic hate speech is framed as the start of total censorship. The inflated chain distracts from the proportional measure under discussion. Across these moves, the language appears rational, but the structure is unsound. Naming the exact fallacy shows how credibility is being manufactured, returns us to evidence and context, and keeps attention on impact within the hate speech domain. What are toxic rhetorical strategies, and how do they keep misogynistic and sexist hate speech in play? Unlike logical fallacies, these moves don't try to win by logic, they lean on tone, irony, and ambiguity to hide the attack and make it feel acceptable. With normalization, a light or jokey tone presents hate speech as ordinary. If it's just a joke, the attack is reframed as harmless and anyone objecting is cast as humorless. This lowers the threshold for concern, recasts norms as oversensitivity, and turns repetition into background noise, so hate speech blends into everyday banter and becomes harder to call out. Tactical ambiguity mixes irony and provocation so intent can be denied. The message lands, but the speaker can step back, I was only joking. If you're offended, that's on you, shifting responsibility onto the target. Different audiences can read the same line differently while the speaker claims plausible deniability. Blame shifting reverses responsibility by treating the target's behavior as the cause of the attack. Attention moves away from the hate speech and onto what the target should have done differently, legitimizing the original message as mere reaction. In reactive victimhood, the speaker claims the victim role to justify the attack. Criticism of hate speech is recast as persecution. Now you can't say anything, so pushback appears unreasonable and accountability looks like censorship. The effect is to frame equality and basic safeguards as a threat. Finally, the red herring, distraction, changes the subject to avoid engagement. Instead of addressing hate speech, the conversation is pulled towards another issue until the original concern fades. The shift creates distance and leaves the initial claim unexamined. Across these strategies, irony, provocation, and ambiguity disguise the attack and normalize hate speech. Naming the move shows how credibility is being manufactured and keeps focus on what the message is doing, not just how it sounds. Much misogynistic and sexist hate speech travels as just a joke. To recognize when humor turns toxic, follow the thread of the message rather than its label. Start with intention. Is the laughter shared or directed at a person or group as the butt of the line? Move on to context. Who is speaking, to which audience, and in what setting and tone? Classroom chat, or a public post that can mobilize others? As we know, the legal threshold requires a public element. Hate speech occurs on public or otherwise publicly accessible channels. A strictly private one-to-one message may be abusive, but it is not hate speech. Then consider effect. What follows after the joke lands? Embarrassment, a stereotype being restated as truth, the room polarizing, or a cue for others to pile on. When targeting is clear and the downstream effect is exclusion or license to attack, this is humor used as a vehicle for hate speech. The claim, "it's only a joke," does not change what the message is doing. If you don't want nasty messages, just stay offline. Let's start there, the first line in the dialogue box. In one sentence, the problem is relocated from public hate speech to the girl's presence online. The follow-up, "So it's my fault if someone insults me?" is then dismissed by a third voice. If you're online, you have to accept everything. 3 lines, and the story is set. The attacker sounds reasonable, the person defending herself is ridiculed, and the internet is treated as a natural force that cannot be shaped. This is what we mean by an implicit story. Every public post, meme, or comment says something about who is right, who is wrong, and which behaviors are normal. In this sequence, the narrative justifies the person insulting, blames girls' online presence, sends the message, "You put yourself out there, so don't complain." When you meet content like this, narrate it back in plain words. Who is cast as reasonable, and who as overreacting? What is really being framed, the hostile message, or the legitimacy of girls being publicly visible? Which worldview is being normalized, perhaps that only those who play along deserve to stay? Remember, in public or publicly accessible spaces, these cues don't just reflect opinion, they organize audience behavior to ignore, to mock, or to pile on. Making the story explicit allows proportionate safeguarding and precise documentation of impact. This slide brings together 3 lenses for reading public content that carries misogynistic and sexist hate speech. They are complementary, each shows you something the others might miss. First, rhetorical listening. We don't only hear the literal words, we attend to tone and communicative intent, the sarcastic delivery, the defensive irony, the provocation packaged as just an opinion. This tells us what the speaker is trying to make the audience feel or do, even when the wording stays just inside policy. Second, narrative mapping. Here we reconstruct the implicit roles in the message, who is speaking and to who is presented as reasonable, who is exaggerated or cast as the enemy. In many hate speech posts, the target is positioned as the problem, while the instigator appears neutral or common sense. Mapping those roles makes the framing explicit. Third, 3-level analysis. We break the message down into explicit, what is overtly being said, implicit, which power relations or social roles are suggested, cultural, which stereotypes or forms of normalized hate are being reinforced across the thread or meme culture. Reading across these levels connects a single post to the wider patterns that give it force. Used together, these tools turn a vague impression into a structured, evidence-based diagnosis of impact and risk in public content. Let's see how the 3 tools we've just analyzed apply to a concrete case. Imagine reading this post. If you don't want to be looked at, cover up. No one forces you to show yourself. First, let's start with rhetorical listening. At first glance, the message seems like just advice, but in reality, it's passive-aggressive. It says, "I'm just offering a suggestion," but in fact, It shifts all responsibility onto those who receive unwanted attention. The message implies that if a woman receives a glance or harassment, it's her fault, as if these sexualized looks are inevitable, and it's up to her to do something to avoid them. This is a classic example of blame shifting, where the victim becomes the cause of the perpetrator's behavior. Next, we have narrative mapping. The voice speaking is impersonal, yet it feels implicitly masculine, giving the impression of neutrality, while actually reinforcing the belief that women must adapt to certain norms. The intended audience is one that already shares the idea of female blame. In this logic, if a woman is looked at or harassed, it's because she exposed herself too much, without acknowledging that the behavior of the harasser or the one judging her is unacceptable. Finally, let's break it down using a 3-level analysis. On the explicit level, the message is clear: if you don't want to be looked at, cover up. On the implicit level, it tells us that if you receive unwanted attention, it's your fault, because somehow you've exposed yourself. But there's also a cultural level that goes beyond that. This message not only justifies harassment but normalizes it, making it seem as if controlling women's bodies is a legitimate response. The blame is shifted from the perpetrator to the victim, perpetuating a view that accepts violence and discrimination as normal. After this module, you can recognize narrative strategies in online misogynistic hate speech and analyze messages using the tools introduced: rhetorical listening, narrative mapping, and 3-level analysis, to decode posts, comments, and memes that convey toxic narratives. Now we move to the practical activity. You'll enter 6 rooms, each with a different challenge focused on spotting and stopping misogynistic and sexist hate speech that is disguised as something else. Your task is to recognize the hidden messages, identify the strategy behind them, and collect the letters that unlock the final password. After each choice, you'll receive feedback explaining why it fits, or doesn't. Next step: please leave this page and go to the next page of the MOOC to start VOXXY, emergency exit. Follow the on-screen instructions there, then return here for the debrief.